This is my attempt to explain how this country got to the point where a mob of right-wingers rioted at the Capitol in an attempt to overthrow our government on January 6th, 2021. If the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging the problem, that's what this video is about. If I missed any, comment below. I want this video to be a bit of a living document. Yeah, I love a good rant because I like what I'm good at.
So it begins.
Fear being the most base human emotion, often more powerful than love or compassion, and the Republicans drive it to the extreme. We are a species that hasn't fully evolved out of authoritarianism. A decades-long white supremacist agenda to persuade its members to infiltrate the military and police. A police system that even allows white supremacists to be hired for law enforcement. I'd blame lazy background checks, but that might be a little too generous. This is probably the most obvious one. A right-wing authoritarian demagogue who said there were very fine people on the violent side of Charlottesville who fomented racism and xenophobia, who told domestic terrorists to, quote, stand by the voter polls, and who told Capitol insurrectionists he loves them. A Republican Party that supported Trump despite knowing exactly who he is. Because they know that going against Trump would hurt their chances of re-election. Because to the Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and the other vermin beasts of the world, power is more important than anything. A highly religious society where the prime religion praises a universal authoritarian whom worshippers cannot question. A religion that teaches people that facts don't matter. You must believe in fantasies such as science isn't real, the glorification of ignorance as if it's virtuous. Blame primarily goes to right-wing hate radio and Fox News. They coddled their audience to not feel inferior to those educated liberals, while also helping the billionaire class through propagandizing. So they pretend their ignorance is virtuous because that's easier than admitting one has a flaw and trying to be a better person. A government that actually doesn't represent us, instead representing the wealthy donor class, leaving space for fake populists to manipulate people into wrongly placing blame on the source of their problems. Extreme income and wealth inequality brought on by 40 years of Reaganomics. Inequality is always a precursor to internal turmoil or the fall of a civilization. 4 decades of corporatism-induced stagnant wages, but a rise in the cost of living, making people desperate, distrustful, nihilistic, and hopeless. The offshoring of manufacturing jobs, leaving people without hope for the future, creating grievance and leaving space for manipulative right-wing propaganda to work on some people into blaming the other. Trump being too narcissistic to deal with the reality that he lost. In other words, denial. Trump being too narcissistic to care that his actions are hurting people. Trump having severe daddy issues that don't allow him to emotionally accept that he lost. Male sexual insecurity and inadequacy that turns into grievance. A media that is basically controlled by a few corporations, which are ruled by people whose goal is not our well-being and is not to keep us properly informed. Leading to a media that is elitist, that is out of touch, which means that the Sherman Anti-Trust Act not being enforced belongs on this list. Media being so out of touch that somehow they didn't take Trump seriously, so they treated the 2016 election as a reality TV show. Journalists not adequately examining Trump, not just in 2016, but for the decades prior. Forbes and other media not looking into Trump's claims of being a self-made billionaire, creating a false image that continues to prop Trump up as a success rather than a loser who pissed away hundreds of millions of dollars he inherited from daddy. A culture that says that if you do not succeed, it is 100% your fault, and that you are a failure. A culture that says if you're middle class or rich, then you're better than other people, which leads to a level of entitlement. Let's get real about these MAGA people that were at the Capitol. They weren't the working class white people. Many were from the suburbs, or were able to actually take time off and travel to DC. If you're barely making it month to month, you don't have the money to do that. Denial that the South fought the war for slavery. The fantasy that the South started the war for a noble cause, rather than keeping an economic system in place that only benefits the rich. Sound familiar? moderates welcoming back the South after the Civil War, and conceding on the Southern argument, all for the sake of the perception of unity. That includes rolling back Reconstruction way too early after the Civil War, which allowed for the South to badly educate generation after generation with lost cause propaganda, allowing for segregation to take place, allowing for right-wing terrorist organizations to form quasi-mob rule and upend democracy, and members of those terrorist organizations infiltrating law enforcement. A culture that values individualism so much that it trains people not to think about what's best for all of us. In other words, a culture that trains the empathy out of us. An economic system and a culture that rewards selfishness to such an extent that a disproportionate number of wealthy and powerful people are narcissistic and sociopathic. A culture that says if your standard of living isn't good enough, then blame the other, punch down, or punch adjacent, instead of having the guts to punch up at the powerful. So there's just too much for this one video. I didn't even get to my foreign policy stuff. There's a lot I listed. Big picture, I'm optimistic that if we understand what led to the insurrection on January 6th, that we can avoid it happening in the future by actually curing the disease. I welcome your comments on what you think led to the coup attempt. Support independent media by liking and sharing this video and by clicking subscribe. This is Alien Perspective. Thanks for watching.